Ayana Blake had just transferred to Meadow Ridge High, a place that seemed like a world away from where she grew up. She came from a neighborhood most of these kids only heard about in whispers, a place where talking back could lead to a fight and showing weakness could get you hurt. She was no stranger to tough situations, but the bullies at her new school didn't see her strength. They saw a quiet black girl, a target for their cruel games, and so they came at her, ramping up the bullying day by day. Then, one afternoon, they showed up with scissors and a plan to provoke a reaction. Laughter filled the air. Someone called it just a joke. The teacher looked the other way. The room fell silent, but Ayana didn't flinch. They thought she was soft, that she'd back down. They were wrong. Before we dive in, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. The sun hung low, too bright for a Monday, bleaching the sky in a dull, indifferent blue that made the town feel sterile, untouched, as if everything here had been meticulously arranged before the first bell even rang. Ayana sat in the back seat of her mom's Honda, watching rows of identical houses blur by, each one neatly manicured, with SUVs parked in driveways, all competing in a quiet suburban race. Her mother had been silent the entire drive, and Ayana hadn't expected anything else. It had been this way for months. Meals in silence, doors closing too firmly, a cold that wasn't from the weather. As they pulled into the school's circular lot, the building loomed ahead, clean and imposing, banners reading "Excellence Through Community" hanging above the entrance. Ayana stared at those words longer than she meant to, her jaw tightening, her fingers gripping the cracked pleather of the door handle. Her mom adjusted the rearview mirror, touched up her lipstick, and muttered something under her breath, almost like a reflex. "You'll be fine." No hug, no good luck, not even a glance in her direction, just a nod toward the school and the rhythmic tap of nails on the steering wheel, as though her mind had already moved on to the errands she had to run. Ayana stepped out without a word, the door shutting quietly behind her. She stood there for a moment, taking in the sight of students streaming through the front doors, backpacks slung carelessly, phones glowing, laughter echoing. It was as if they'd all known each other forever. No one looked her way, yet she could feel it. The sidelong glances, the whispering that followed her, even if no one actually spoke. She adjusted the strap on her backpack, lifted her chin just a little, and walked in as though none of it mattered. The first thing she noticed was the smell. It wasn't the bleach and metal clean she was used to. Instead, it was a soft, lemony scent, curated, almost intentional. The hallways were wide, the lockers painted in two-tone blue, and the floors so polished they mirrored the white ceiling tiles. It felt like a different world here, quiet in places where it shouldn't be, and loud in others where it shouldn't be. It was structured like a maze, and everyone already knew their way, except for her. Her homeroom teacher, a woman with a smile too sweet to be genuine, greeted her with a voice that carried an edge. "Welcome, Ayana. I've heard we've got a strong student joining us." The way she emphasized strong made Ayana feel like an exhibit rather than a person. She took the seat at the back corner, her gaze fixed on the empty notebook in front of her, while whispers floated around her. The first few periods dragged by in a blur, teachers listing syllabi, classmates eyeing her like she was a new animal at the zoo. When lunch arrived, Ayana carried her tray through the cafeteria, feeling like she was crossing enemy territory. Most of the tables were already occupied, with people laughing and talking like they belonged. She spotted an empty spot near the edge and headed toward it, only to see someone slide into the seat just before she got there. No apology, just a look that lingered too long. She moved on, finally settling at a lonely table near the exit and eating in silence. It was there that she saw them for the first time, Austin Riddell and his two sidekicks, Kyle and Brandon. They walked with a swagger that came from generations of privilege, their eyes scanning the cafeteria, deciding who or what to amuse themselves with. When Austin's gaze landed on Ayana, there was a flash of recognition. Not the kind that said, "I know you," but the kind that said, "I've seen your type before." His smile was thin, his teeth too perfect, and he nudged Brandon, who let out a low whistle. Their heads leaned together, like they were sharing a private joke. Ayanna didn't look away. She didn't smile. She just stared back, blank and unblinking, until they moved on. The next day, it started small. Someone bumped her shoulder harder than necessary. The tension at Meadow Ridge High was escalating, and Ayanna Blake felt it in every corner. The bullying started small. Someone knocked her pencil off her desk in the hallway with a careless flick. A snicker here, a whispered name there. "Ghetto," they said. "She's got attitude, thinks she's tough." Ayanna said nothing. She kept her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes focused on the clock. Her mind retreated to the familiar rhythm of muscle memory, how to roll her shoulders, how to shift her stance, how to listen for footwork. She'd promised herself no fights, not here, not again. But there was something in the air, something crawling low and slow, that told her this wouldn't stop until someone made it. By the second week, the walls seemed to whisper their judgment. The smiles grew tighter. The stares lingered longer. The air itself felt filtered, as though someone had decided she didn't belong, and it was made clear in the quietest, most persistent way. It didn't come all at once, but piece by piece the message formed, silent yet undeniable. You don't fit here. In chemistry class, when Ayanna answered a question correctly, someone behind her snorted. A whisper floated through the air, just loud enough for her to catch. Must have learned that in hood school. She paused only for a second, pencil hovering mid-stroke, but then she continued writing without looking back. Kyle, who had muttered it, leaned toward Brandon and chuckled under his breath. "Straight out of Compton, over here solving equations." Brandon laughed. "Yo, she probably got that answer trading crack for calculators." Ayanna heard every word, but she didn't flinch. Silence, when held just right, can be heavier than any insult. She tapped her pencil lightly against the desk, once, then again, the same way she used to tap her fists against concrete before Darius taught her to wrap them up. By gym class, things had escalated. During basketball drills, Kyle shoved past her, throwing his shoulder hard enough to send her stumbling. "Watch it, Queen Latifah," he sneered as he passed. Ayanna caught herself, steadying herself without falling. Slowly she straightened, looked him dead in the eye. "That's not even clever," she said, her voice low and measured, not angry, just dismissive. Kyle blinked, stunned. He opened his mouth, but before he could say anything, Ayanna turned away. It wasn't much, but it cracked the air like glass. Kyle stood there, the smirk half-formed on his face. Brandon behind him let out a low, "Ooh!" Austin, always nearby but never too close, tilted his head from the bleachers with a faint smile. He didn't laugh. He just watched her like she'd done something interesting. After class, Ayanna was walking back through the corridor toward her locker when Austin fell in step beside her, like it had been planned. "You got a little mouth on you," he said casually. Ayanna didn't break stride. "You got a lot of nothing coming out of yours." He laughed softly. "I see what this is. New girl trying to prove something." "I'm not trying," she said, eyes straight ahead. "I'm not new, just relocated." Austin clicked his tongue. "Where from?" Ayanna didn't answer. He leaned in a little, dropping his voice. "Bet it wasn't anywhere like this." This time, she looked at him directly, her gaze sharp as wire. "Not even close." Austin's smile faltered for just a moment, something uncertain flickering in his eyes. Then he stepped back, raising his hands like he was playing. "All right, tough girl. Let's see how long that fire lasts." The next morning, Ayanna opened her locker to find it stuffed with torn-up scraps of paper, old grocery ads, ripped notebook pages. At first glance, it seemed random. but as she pulled out the clumps, she saw the black Sharpie marks scrawled across the edges. "Go back. Nobody wants you here." She stood motionless for a moment, the papers fluttering at her feet. Some passing students noticed but didn't stop. One girl glanced, then quickly looked away. Another giggled under her breath and walked faster. Ayana crouched down, gathered the papers into one hand, stuffed them deep into her backpack, and closed the locker with a soft, deliberate click. She didn't report it. Not yet, but someone had seen. Later that afternoon, as Ayana waited for the bus near the shadowed brick columns by the main entrance, a voice cut through the quiet. "You doing all right here?" She turned to see Principal Hughes, tall and clean-cut, with skin as dark as her father's. His eyes carried stories without words, and his presence was quiet yet commanding, like someone who knew when to speak and when to let silence speak for him. She gave a slight nod. "I'm good." His gaze held hers for a moment longer. "You sure you're not invisible?" "I never said I was," she replied. He smiled faintly. "No, you didn't, but I've seen that look before." She raised an eyebrow. "What look is that?" "The one that says, I know exactly how far I can be pushed before someone learns they picked the wrong one." Ayana's lips twitched just slightly. "That's pretty specific." "I've been here a while," he said simply. "And I'm not new either." She glanced at him. This man, who wore his calm like armor, who hadn't come to offer pity or false comfort, but something heavier. Ayana nodded once, her gaze steady. "If anything crosses the line," Principal Hughes' voice dropped slightly, "and you want it documented, you come to me. I'll handle it the right way." "What's the right way?" Ayana asked, curious. "The way they don't expect," he replied, his eyes intense. As the bus rumbled into view, Ayana gave him one last look. "Thanks," she said quietly. He stepped aside and nodded. "Anytime, Ms. Blake." She boarded the bus in silence, dropped into the seat beside the window, and let the weight of the day settle across her shoulders like a wet cloth. She could feel it rising beneath her skin. Not fear, not pain, but something colder, something older. They thought she'd just keep absorbing it, but they hadn't taken anything from her yet. Not really, not yet. It happened on a Wednesday, during that slow stretch of the week where the school's rhythm dragged a little, like even time itself was tired. The sky outside was a dull gray, pressing down on everything, and inside, the hallways felt strangely quiet, as if the air had forgotten how to move. Ayana felt it the moment she walked through the front doors. She didn't have a word for it, but it clung to her skin, tight, invisible, heavy. She caught them watching her early that day, first in the hallway near her locker, where Austin leaned against the metal locker like he had nowhere better to be, his thumbs tapping casually at his phone, eyes flicking toward her just long enough to make it known. Then, in third period, Brandon kept turning halfway in his seat, whispering to Kyle, both of them smirking like boys who already knew how the day would end. Their laughter was low, but carried. By fourth period, Ayana had already started counting the ways they were circling her without touching. Whispers behind her, laughter that started too late, people turning to look and then quickly looking away like they didn't want to get involved. There were no names this time, no shoves, just eyes watching, measuring. The warning came in the form of silence. It was during sixth period art class that it finally happened. The class had been given creative freedom. Students scattered across the room with sketch pads, watercolors, glue sticks, and the school issued scissors with dull metal blades. Ms. Henley, the teacher, was in the corner talking with a student about portfolio submissions, while others chatted or stared blankly at their drawings, more focused on the clock than the paper. Ayana was seated near the back, her chair angled toward the window, her pencil tracing soft lines on the blank page in front of her. She wasn't drawing anything in particular, just shapes, movement, the act of staying occupied. She didn't notice Brandon move behind her, and she didn't hear the blade. It happened fast, so fast she didn't realize what had been done until it was too late. There was the faint sound of scissors opening and closing, the whisper of hair being sliced, and then the sharp tug near her scalp that made her freeze, not from pain, but instinct. She reached up slowly, her fingers brushing the back of her head. Her hand came away with frayed ends. Her braid, her thick, tightly woven braid, had been cut. The strands fell loosely in her hand, the blunt edge of the severed weave brushing her palm, as if it didn't understand what had just happened either. Behind her, Brandon laughed. "Yo, oh my God," Kyle gasped from across the table. "Did you just... Dude, that's messed up." Brandon held up the severed braid like it was a trophy, swinging it slightly. "I thought she might want to lighten up the load. This stuff's heavy, right?" Ayanna didn't turn around. She stared at the braid in her hand, unmoving. Austin's voice came from across the room, louder now, just theatrical enough to draw attention. "Damn, I didn't think you'd actually do it. That's bold. You think she's going to cry?" More laughter followed, soft gasps, shocked whispers, the kind that wrapped around cruelty and turned it into entertainment. Ayanna still hadn't moved. She wasn't staring at the hair. She was staring past it, through it, at something far away, distant. Her body had gone still and quiet in a way that made the sound of laughter seem too sharp, too loud. Brandon's voice dropped close again, just behind her ear. "Don't take it personal. Just a little joke. You're always so serious. Figured you needed a makeover." That was when she stood. The chair scraped slowly against the floor, and the sound was enough to break the rhythm of laughter in the room. She didn't speak. She didn't scream. She simply rose from her seat, turned to face him, and looked down at the braid in his hand. Brandon blinked. "Relax," he said suddenly, unsure. "It's not like it was real or anything." Ayanna stared at him, her expression unreadable. "You think that makes it better?" Kyle stepped forward quickly, trying to regain control of the situation. "Look, no one's trying to hurt feelings. It's just hair, right?" Austin, still lounging in his chair nearby, leaned back and crossed his arms. "I mean, if you make it a statement, you wear it like armor, people are going to test it. That's just how it goes." Ayanna looked at him now, her voice calm, too calm. "You think this is about hair?" Austin smirked. "Isn't it?" She took one step forward, then another. The silence around her grew denser with every movement. Brandon had stopped laughing now, his hand lowering. The braid dropped to the floor. Ms. Henley finally looked up. Ayanna's face remained calm, even as her hands curled into fists at her sides. "You don't get to touch me," she said, her voice low and steady. "You don't get to take something from me and call it a joke." Brandon raised his hands, a nervous grin trying to break the tension. Okay, just calm down," he said. But Ayanna wasn't angry, not in the way they expected. She wasn't yelling, she wasn't shaking, she wasn't crumbling into tears like they had probably imagined, grinning over some group text, sure they thought she would run out of the room in shame. But instead, Ayanna was quiet, controlled, watching them. As she took another step toward him, something shifted in Brandon's face. His grin faltered, his voice caught. The realization hit him. This wasn't over. It had just begun. For a moment, it was like the entire room had forgotten how to breathe. The braid lay discarded on the floor like something forgotten, left in the middle of a conversation no one wanted to finish. Miss Henley, frozen behind her desk, looked between the faces in the room, trying to make sense of what was happening, but not moving to intervene. Not yet. Ayanna stood there at the center of the silence, her hands still at her sides, her back straight, her gaze now fixed on Brandon, who had begun stepping away as if the distance between them could somehow undo what he had done. But she wasn't walking toward him anymore. She was calculating, the memory of her cousin's voice echoing deep within her. "Don't move first unless you're forced." But when you do, finish it fast and clean. She could still feel the sting on the back of her scalp where the braid had been severed, a sharp throb of humiliation pulsing beneath her skin, but she didn't touch it again. The damage was done, and everyone had seen it. Kyle tried to pull Brandon away, his voice low. "Dude, chill. Let's go. She's freaking out." But Brandon didn't move. Austin, still leaning against the back table, arms folded, didn't laugh. His eyes were sharp now, no longer filled with arrogance, but with that weary curiosity, as if he had misjudged something and wasn't sure how to fix it. Ayanna stepped forward again, slow and measured, her gaze locked on Brandon. He raised his hand, as if to explain. "Look, I said I'm sorry, okay? It was just hair. It's not like we—" Before he could finish, her fist connected with a brutal, sudden snap. A clean right hook landed square on his cheekbone, the sound of it sharp and ugly. The crunch of cartilage followed, and Brandon was sent crashing backward into the art table. The table rocked violently, jars of paint scattering across the room as students gasped in shock. Brandon crumpled, clutching his face with both hands as blood poured from his nose. Ms. Henley screamed something, but Ayanna had already moved. Kyle lunged toward her, but she shifted sideways, grabbing his arm mid-swing, twisting his wrist back and slamming his elbow down across the edge of the table. He shrieked, buckled, and dropped with a choked moan, cradling his arm as tears sprang to his eyes. Austin moved next, not to fight, but to step between them, hands raised. All right, back up. You made your point. You win." Ayanna didn't blink. "No," she said, her voice colder than steel. "You don't get to talk." Austin's mouth twitched, but he didn't push it. He took a slow step back, hands still raised, his face now stripped of its arrogance. What remained was a recognition, quiet, tense, and edged with fear. A group of students backed toward the door, some watching with wide eyes, others fumbling to pull out their phones, unsure if they should help or hide. "Ms." Henley finally snapped out of it, reaching for the intercom button at her desk, her voice shrill with panic. "We need assistance in room 316 right now. Security now." Ayanna stood in the center of the wreckage, paint bottles overturned, chairs knocked sideways, papers scattered like fallen leaves. She wasn't breathing hard. She wasn't flushed or panicked. She was still, her eyes scanning the room slowly before they dropped to the braid on the floor. She picked it up, held it in her hands like something sacred, then turned and walked out. She didn't run. She didn't speak. She walked calmly through the door and into the hallway, her shoes echoing against the linoleum in a rhythm that seemed too even for what had just happened. Chaos built behind her, students shouting, footsteps pounding, "Ms." Henley's voice shrill with panic, but Ayanna didn't stop. She moved down the corridor as if she already knew where she was headed, already knew what they would say, already knew none of it mattered. By the time the assistant principal rounded the corner with 2 campus officers in tow, Ayanna was waiting. She stood quietly at the edge of the stairwell, hands behind her back, the severed braid dangling loosely in her grip. They shouted for her to freeze, but she didn't move. They rushed toward her, their voices raised, hands half reaching for restraints. But it wasn't necessary. She didn't resist. She didn't protest as they flanked her, walking her toward the main office. She didn't speak as they asked her what happened. She just kept her eyes ahead, jaw set, her silence heavy enough to hush the hallway around them. Word had already spread by the time they arrived at the front office. Students were lined against the walls, pretending to look at posters but straining to hear through the door. Someone whispered her name. Someone else muttered, "She snapped." A third voice said, "They cut her hair," and that, more than anything, rippled through the crowd like static. Inside the principal's office, Darnell Hughes stood waiting. He didn't look surprised when they walked her in. Tall and black, his presence quiet but unshakable, dressed in dark slacks and a gray button-up with sleeves rolled neatly up, he was a figure who didn't need to speak loudly to command attention. Hughes, his sleeves rolled to the elbows, dismissed the security staff with a brief nod. "Close the door," he said. They hesitated. "She's not going anywhere. You can close it." The door shut with a soft click. Principal Hughes studied Ayanna for a long moment, then gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit down, Ayanna." She did, her body stiff, the severed braid still tightly gripped in her hand, her fingers curled around it, as if she hadn't decided yet whether it was something to protect or something to bury. The room was quiet, sealed off from the chaos outside. Through the thick paneled window, she could see a few students lingering near the hallway corners, pretending not to listen. Hughes didn't look at the window. His gaze stayed on her. His elbows rested on the desk, hands folded. His body was still, not stiff, but deliberate. The way a man sits when he knows every word about to be spoken matters more than anything else that came before. "I read the report from the art teacher," he said quietly, his voice even but patient, waiting. "She said you attacked 3 students. One's got a broken nose, another's being sent for x-rays on his arm." Ayanna didn't respond. Her eyes dropped to the floor for a brief moment, not in shame, but in thought, measured calm, bracing for the storm she knew was coming. "Let me ask you again," Hughes continued, leaning forward slightly. "Why?" Ayanna's voice came softer this time, more tired than angry. "They cut my hair." He nodded, not with surprise, not as if the words startled him, but like they confirmed something he'd already suspected deep in his bones. Still, he let the silence hang for a moment longer, studying her with a patience that didn't feel like judgment. "I figured that's what it was," he said finally. "I watched the security feed from the hallway after you walked out. You didn't run. You didn't resist. You waited. That's not the kind of reaction that comes from someone who just snapped." Her eyes flicked up now, meeting his, not with challenge, but curiosity. She hadn't expected that. Not from an administrator, not from an adult in a pressed shirt and a clean office who could have buried her in a dozen disciplinary buzzwords and official protocols by now. "Most people," he continued, "when they hear a black girl fought 3 white boys and sent 2 of them to the nurse, they think one thing. They think violence. They think rage. They think threat." "I know," Ayanna said, her voice flat. "They always do," he said, his tone lowering, growing slower. "But when I hear it, I start asking what happened before the fight. I ask what didn't get recorded, what got laughed off, what teachers missed or ignored. And most of the time, if I'm being honest," he exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening, "no one wants those questions answered." Ayanna sat back in the chair, still holding the braid. "I didn't want to fight," she said after a beat. "I wanted to finish the day, go home, breathe. That's all." "Then why didn't you walk away?" Hughes asked. She looked at him, her eyes dry, her mouth pulled tight against the rising heat in her throat. "Because I've walked away 100 times. Because I've ignored the comments, the little things, the accidents. Because I sat still and didn't react, and it only made them push harder, laugh louder, get bolder." She opened her palm, showing him the frayed, uneven end of the braid. "And then they took this." Principal Hughes stared at the braid, his expression unreadable. "It wasn't just hair." "No," she said. "It never is." There was a long pause. He leaned back slowly in his chair, exhaled again, then spoke with the kind of quiet that carried more weight than yelling ever could. "My grandmother used to braid my cousin's hair every Sunday, said it was part of her crown, said the world would try to rip it off one way or another, through policies, through stares, through silence. But if you wore it with pride, if you knew what it meant, then nobody could take it without a fight." Ayanna didn't smile, but something in her shoulders loosened slightly. "I have to suspend you," he said, his voice steady now. 3 days out of school. I figured, she replied. But I'm not expelling you, he added quickly. They're going to push for that. Parents, board members, maybe even the district. They're going to say you're a danger, that you need to be removed. Ayana's lips pressed together. And when they do, he said, I'm going to ask for the footage from inside that classroom. I'm going to file a report of my own. I'm going to start asking questions that make people uncomfortable. She watched him carefully. Why? Because, he said slowly, I've spent my whole life walking the line between doing the job they gave me and doing the job that matters. And today, I've decided those two things don't have to be different anymore. He reached into his drawer and pulled out a plain manila envelope, sliding it across the desk. Inside is your suspension paperwork. You'll sign it, I'll file it, and you'll go home. She took the envelope but didn't open it. But that's not the end of this, he said. You understand me? She nodded once, slowly. You've been fighting alone since the first day you walked in here, he said. You don't have to anymore. Her grip loosened on the braid just slightly, as if some part of her was starting to believe him. And for the first time since she'd stepped into that room, she said something that sounded almost like hope. Okay. The morning after the incident, the school parking lot filled earlier than usual. The sky was still pale with the sunrise when the first black SUV rolled up to the administration building, followed by a silver Lexus and a polished white BMW with tinted windows that didn't belong to any teacher on staff. They came in waves, buttoned up and loud in that quiet, controlled way, the kind of presence that didn't need to shout to take up space. They were the kind of parents who didn't ask questions. They arrived expecting explanations, apologies, and consequences. Hughes stood at the edge of the hallway, watching the storm gather through the tall windows by the main entrance. He didn't move right away. Slowly, he sipped his coffee, unfazed by the urgency in the front desk's frantic voice over the intercom. They're here, sir. Should we bring in a mediator? Do you want backup from the board? He pressed the button gently, his voice calm. No. Send them to the conference room. I'll be there shortly. When he stepped into the room, they were already standing. 3 fathers and 3 mothers, all in expensive coats slung over chairs, polished watches glinting beneath the soft ceiling lights. They looked at him the way corporate executives look at a man they've already decided is replaceable. One of the mothers, a blonde in a red blazer and pearl necklace, had her arms crossed and lips pursed so tightly they looked bloodless. Her eyes locked onto him as soon as he entered. You're Principal Hughes? She asked, her tone not a question, but an accusation. I am, he replied, nodding once. They didn't sit down, and neither did he. The silence stretched between them until the tallest of the men, a broad-shouldered figure in a tailored suit and tan trench coat, stepped forward. Let's skip the pleasantries, he said. My son came home with a busted nose and a black eye. You want to explain to me why the girl who did it isn't in a holding cell? She was suspended, Hughes replied evenly. 3 days out of school. Standard protocol for physical altercations resulting in injury. That wasn't an altercation, the blonde woman snapped. It was a savage attack. No, Hughes said calmly. It was a response. The room tensed. Excuse me, another father said. Brandon's, if I remember correctly. You're defending her? I'm stating the facts, Hughes said, his voice low but firm. Your son's approached a student during class, used a pair of school-issued scissors to cut her hair without her consent, and then publicly mocked her afterward. That's assault. That's humiliation. That's emotional violence. And it provoked a physical response. You don't understand what you're saying, the blonde woman hissed. You're trying to justify violence against white students. No, Hughes said, his tone sharpening just slightly. I'm trying to justify truth. One of the men stepped closer, his voice dropping into something quieter but far more dangerous. We've been generous with this school, with this district. I sit on the school board. My firm sponsors your athletics department. And now my son is afraid to come to school because you're allowing some girl with a chip on her shoulder to... I'm allowing her to attend a school where she was enrolled, where she has every right to be, and where she should have been protected from. The moment she arrived, Hughes interrupted, his voice clear now, cutting through the layered entitlement with the precision of a scalpel. You're not angry because your sons were attacked. You're angry because someone fought back, and you weren't prepared for what that looked like. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was volatile, vibrating just under the surface, with the barely restrained fury of people who had spent their entire lives being listened to. One of the mothers shook her head slowly, speaking now with the cold clarity of someone who knew where her power came from. You realize this is going to escalate, don't you? We're not going to let this go, not after what she did. Not after the media gets wind of it. I'm counting on it, Hughes said simply. They blinked, confused. He stepped around the conference table now, moving slowly, deliberately, his tone softening just enough to force them to lean in. Because once the media gets wind of it, they'll also get the footage of 3 boys surrounding a girl in class, cutting her hair, laughing, threatening. Once the media sees that tape, I'm willing to bet the public will understand why that girl defended herself. And if not the media, then the courts. You wouldn't, one of them growled. I already have, he replied. The footage is being reviewed by the district superintendent as we speak. So if you're here to file complaints, by all means, I'll add them to the documentation. But if you're here to intimidate me, you're wasting your time. One of the fathers pointed a finger. You'll lose your job over this. Hughes smiled faintly. If I do, it'll be doing the right thing. They didn't respond to that, not with words. Instead, they gathered their coats in silence, their movements stiff with the kind of anger that came from knowing they hadn't won. The blonde mother reached the door last, pausing just long enough to glance over her shoulder. You've made a serious mistake. Hughes looked back at her, his expression calm and unmoved. No, ma'am, he said quietly. I've made a choice. The tension didn't fade after the meeting. It only changed shape. The parents had stormed out without getting what they came for, but that didn't mean they'd stopped. The email started that same afternoon, carbon copied to board members and the superintendent, full of sharp language and veiled threats about campus safety and maintaining district standards. There were murmurs of lawsuits, whispers about donors reconsidering their support, and warnings passed down through administrative channels about the optics of the situation. Principal Hughes read every line with quiet, surgical focus. He printed them all, filed them by name. Hughes responded only when necessary, and when he did, his replies were brief, formal, and always accompanied by a timestamp from the video that showed exactly what had happened in that classroom. The footage wasn't graphic. It didn't show fists or blood, but it showed something worse. Austin leaning back with a smirk, Brandon hovering behind Ayanna with scissors, and the moment her braid was taken like it was nothing. Hughes didn't raise his voice. He didn't grandstand. He documented. While he did that, Ayanna watched. She returned to school on the 4th day, walking through the front doors without looking left or right, her back straight, her face unreadable. The whispers followed her down the hall like smoke curling between lockers and brushing past eavesdropping students who weren't bold enough to speak aloud. Some stared, some turned away, and a few watched with something like awe, as if they couldn't decide whether she was dangerous or just untouchable now. She made it through the day with minimal interference. Teachers avoided eye contact. No one called on her in class. The air around her had shifted. Heavier now, electric in a way that made people keep their distance. But it wasn't fear she carried. It was something deeper. It was control. In the afternoon, Principal Hughes called her to his office, not with a referral slip or a reprimand, just a quiet message passed through a guidance counselor. He'd like to see you when you're free. She found him leaning over a row of binders in his office, his desk unusually cluttered with printouts, meeting notes, and security logs. He gestured for her to close the door. "You okay walking in here?" he asked without looking up. She gave a slight shrug. "I'm used to people watching me." He nodded, standing straight. "Good, because they still are." He motioned for her to sit, then placed a single manila folder in front of her. Inside were printed photos, screenshots from security footage. One showed Brandon standing behind her. Another, clearer shot captured the scissors mid-air. No blood, no action, just evidence. "I've sent this to the superintendent," he said. "I'm drafting a report to submit to the state. It'll get buried if it comes from me alone, but if a pattern shows up—" "What pattern?" she asked, watching him closely. Hughes tapped a finger on the edge of the folder. "That's where you come in." She leaned forward, her brows tightening. He opened a drawer and pulled out a thin, spiral-bound notebook, the kind handed out at staff trainings, and slid it across the desk. Inside were 3 names she recognized. Students of color, all quiet, all recent transfers. Each one had a brief note beside their name: grade drop, locker vandalized, report dismissed, disciplinary warning issued. "I started keeping track last semester," he said. "Not just because of you, because it's been happening a long time, just small enough to get ignored." Ayanna stared at the names, reading them twice. "They never came forward?" "Some tried," Hughes said. "Got brushed off, told to adjust, to be less sensitive, told that not everything was about race." Ayanna looked up. "But it is." "Exactly," he said. She sat back, her fingers resting lightly on the notebook. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to watch," he said carefully. "If you see something, write it down. Names, times, teachers who look away, students who start pushing things further. Document everything, but don't engage unless you have to." "You think they're still going to come at me?" "I know they are," he said, "but not the same way. They're going to use policy now. Dress code violations, aggressive language, anything they can twist to make you look unstable." Ayanna exhaled slowly. "So, I'm bait." "No," Hughes said, his voice calm but deliberate. "You're leverage." He sat across from her, folding his hands. "They underestimated you. That was their first mistake. Their second was assuming that you were alone." She met his gaze, eyes narrowing. "And what happens if I do this and it doesn't change anything?" "Then we make it louder," he said. "But first, we make it undeniable." She nodded once, just slightly. And that was how it began. Not with a march or a headline, but with a quiet notebook passed between 2 people who understood the system too well to trust it. Ayanna carried it in the bottom of her backpack, buried beneath her books, hidden like a weapon with the safety still on. In the following weeks, she watched. She listened. She wrote. It didn't take long for the school's surface calm to start unraveling, not in dramatic ways, but in quiet, granular fractures, the kind that didn't make headlines but bled through routine like rust under paint. A week after Ayanna returned from her suspension, the morning announcements included a rushed reminder about respectful conduct and appropriate appearance. The phrasing was so vague it could have applied to anyone, but the timing made it clear who it was meant for. Students exchanged looks. Some rolled their eyes. Others glanced sideways at her desk like she was a loaded question they weren't ready to answer. Ayanna didn't react. She'd learned to let the first wave roll past. It was never about that moment. It was about what followed. In the second week, she saw it happen again. Another girl, smaller than her, Latina, shoved in the hallway by a boy twice her size. His laughter was careless, his voice sharp with mockery. Hughes and was led into his office, where he was waiting by the window, arms folded. The late afternoon light cast long shadows across the room, and the front desk had already gone dark, the hallway empty of students and staff. He nodded toward the door behind her. "Lock it," he said quietly. She did, without asking why. He turned back to face her and gestured to a small folder on his desk. "Someone sent that to me anonymously," he said. "Internal staff thread forwarded from a teacher account." Ayana opened the folder and scanned the contents, a string of emails, the language coded but unmistakable. Teachers discussing recurring discipline problems tied to students from less structured homes. Another line referenced outside cultural influences. Though no names were included, the context was clear. She read a line aloud, her voice cold. "Some of these girls come in here looking for trouble. They need structure, not sympathy." Principal Hughes leaned against the desk, arms still crossed. That was from a faculty member on Ayana's third period rotation, the same one who ignored Brandon's first incident. She let the paper fall back onto the desk. "They're building a case against me." He nodded once. "Not just you, against everything that threatens their version of order. Even if it's the truth, especially if it's the truth." Ayana's jaw tightened. "So, what now?" "We watch for fractures," he said. "And when they start to split, we drive the wedge." The wedge came faster than either of them expected. 2 days later, one of the janitors, a quiet black man named Reggie who usually kept to himself, stopped Ayana in the hallway just as the bell rang for the last period. His voice was low, his eyes darting toward the empty hallway. "I saw what happened in the art room," he said quickly. "That day, I was replacing a light fixture above the exit. No one looked up." Ayana stared at him. "Why are you telling me now?" He hesitated. "Because I've seen this before. Not the scissors, the aftermath, the way they twist it, the way it eats people." She nodded slowly. "Would you say it if someone asked?" His eyes flicked to the hallway again. "If the right person asked." When she relayed the conversation to Principal Hughes, his expression didn't change. He only murmured, "That's the beginning." Another fracture appeared during a routine staff meeting when a young English teacher, Miss Chandler, barely out of grad school, asked during the equity segment why no students had been interviewed before the district issued its statement about the fight. Her voice trembled, but the question landed like a crack of thunder. No one answered. The next day, Ayana found her name missing from the professional development committee she'd been assigned to all year. She recorded that too. She wrote everything. She watched the system bend and reposition, watched teachers avoid her eyes, watched students choose sides without saying a word. She wasn't a mystery anymore. She was a test, and no one wanted to be the one who failed it. It started again during lunch, because of course it did. It was always in the places where teachers looked but didn't see, where administrators assumed a quiet cafeteria meant everything was fine. Ayana was sitting alone as usual, her tray mostly untouched, her back to the window near the far end of the room where the light poured in but never quite reached her. She liked that spot. Quiet, half-shadowed, a place where she could observe without being observed. But today, she could feel it before she saw it. The shift, the way the voices behind her got just a little louder. The familiar cadence of Brandon's laughter, Kyle's mock whispering, and Austin's voice, measured but dripping with performance. Like everything he said was meant for an invisible audience. They hadn't tried anything in days, maybe weeks. But she should have known better than to assume they were done. She kept her head down at first. It was small. A grape rolled across her table. Then a balled-up napkin landed next to her tray. She didn't flinch. She didn't look up. Her pen moved steadily across the corner of a blank notebook page, recording each thing as it came. 11:38. Grape rolled across table from northwest angle. 11:40. Napkin tossed from Kyle, laughing. 11:42. Brandon mimicking my posture, mocking voice under breath. 11:43. Austin speaking louder now, watching me for a reaction. And then, 11:44. Plastic fork hits tray. "Why don't you smile?" from Austin. That was when she looked up, slowly, calmly. Her eyes met Austin's, and he froze. just briefly, just long enough for the performance to falter. She didn't speak. She didn't scowl or retreat. She simply held his gaze until he looked away, coughed, and turned back to his friends, as if he hadn't just lost something he couldn't name. She didn't need to fight them anymore. She just had to watch them fail in real time. She stood, picked up her tray, and walked past their table without rushing, without a word. As she passed, Kyle muttered under his breath, "Crazy witch." But she was already gone, walking straight toward the main office. The tight coil of rage in her chest wound so tightly it burned without smoke. She asked to see Principal Hughes. "Hughes," the secretary hesitated. "He's in a meeting," she said, offering to leave a note. "No," Ayanna replied evenly. "I'll wait." She stood in the corner near the glass case of trophies, not moving, her expression unreadable. It took 15 minutes. She didn't shift once. When Hughes emerged from his office, jacket off and sleeves rolled to the elbows, he spotted her immediately and raised an eyebrow. "You all right?" "Now I am," she said. He opened the door without asking why she was there. "Inside," he said. She placed her notebook on the desk and slid it toward him. "Open to the latest page." He read in silence, nodding as his eyes moved line by line. "They're starting again," she said quietly. "Testing the boundaries, seeing what they can get away with now that the heat's died down." "Anyone else see it?" She nodded. "A few students, maybe 2 tables over. One teacher near the front, but she was on her phone." Hughes flipped the page, saw a note in the corner written in small, precise print. "Camera location, northeast corner. Diagonal line of sight blocked by pillar unless seated." He looked up, surprised. "You mapped the blind spots?" Ayanna's voice didn't change. "You said to make it undeniable." His lips twitched, not quite a smile, but something close to approval. "You've been listening." "They don't think they're being watched," she said. "They think no one cares." "Most people don't," he replied. "Not until it touches them directly." He pulled out his phone, typed a quick message, then turned back to her. "I'll request the lunchroom footage from the district's IT office before they can tamper with it, but we'll need statements, witnesses." "They won't speak," she said. "Not unless someone else does first." "You volunteering?" he asked. Ayanna met his gaze. "I'll go first." There was a pause, just long enough for the weight of those words to settle. Then he nodded slowly. "All right, let's make this official." They drafted a report together. Her notes laid out in clean, unbroken detail, timestamps, names, descriptions. Hughes's tone remained calm as he typed, but his fingers moved with the steady rhythm of a man who was done asking for permission. When they finished, he looked at her. "They're not going to like this." "I'm not trying to be liked," she said. "You're trying to be heard." She nodded. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "Then it's time we give you a microphone." It started small, the way all reckonings do. First with a flicker of doubt in places used to certainty, then with voices that didn't shout but couldn't be ignored. After Ayanna filed her statement, after Hughes sent the video request and secured the footage before anyone could interfere, something subtle shifted in the building. It was hard to name at first, but she felt it in the way the front office grew quieter when she passed, in the way some teachers paused too long before asking her to read aloud or hand out papers. No one said anything outright. No one had to. The fear wasn't of what she'd done. It was of what she might do next. The principal, meanwhile, moved with a deliberate calm that masked how fast things were building beneath the surface. Meetings with district liaisons became more frequent. His inbox filled with carefully worded questions from school board members who had previously kept their distance. But what none of them realized, at least not yet, was that Hughes wasn't trying to calm the waters. He was waiting for the tide to rise. By the end of that week, the footage from the lunchroom had been logged, clipped, and submitted alongside Ayanna's report. In the video, The events played out with no commentary, no edits. You could see her sitting alone, unmoving, while the boys behind her laughed, tossed food, and mocked her posture. At 11:44, you could clearly hear Austin's voice. "Why don't you smile?" Then, the long-awaited pause when she turned and stared. That moment, that silence, was more damning than any act of violence. When Hughes submitted the report to the district, he attached not just the footage and Ayanna's written account, but a string of other documents, photocopied disciplinary records from the previous year, filed complaints from 3 other students who'd reported the same group of boys, all dismissed as unsubstantiated. Names, dates, patterns, the kind of paper trail that wasn't dramatic, but meticulous, heavy. A local journalist, a young black woman named Lena Mercer, who had covered education politics in the district for years, caught wind of the growing unrest. She reached out directly to Hughes, then to Ayanna, careful in her questions, never pushing too hard. She'd seen enough stories like this fall apart the moment they were sensationalized. "What made this one different?" she asked. "Was it the clarity, the paper, the video, the silence?" She asked Ayanna for an interview. Ayanna agreed, but not for television, not for drama. A sit-down, one camera, no lights, just her voice. They met in the media room after school hours, long after the hallways had emptied and the afternoon sun had dimmed to a soft gold that made shadows long and soft. Hughes waited outside, not hovering, just nearby. The custodian paused to listen. The security guard didn't interrupt. When Ayanna sat across from the camera, her hands resting on her thighs, her expression unreadable, the room felt different. She was ready to speak, but the weight of her silence was just as loud. "Sometimes they don't change because of a speech," Hughes said as they sat side by side in his office, the walls lined with files and quiet determination. "But history has a way of making things undeniable." Ayanna didn't reply at first, her hands folded in her lap, the weight of everything that had led them here pressing down on her shoulders. She had already spoken in her interview. She had already shared her story, but something had shifted in the room. She wasn't just a student anymore. She wasn't just a victim. She was a symbol, silent, measured, yet undeniable. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "I don't want to go. I don't think it's going to change anything." Hughes didn't try to persuade her with empty promises. Instead, he nodded slowly, understanding. "I get it. But sometimes, Ayanna, you have to speak the truth, even when you know they'll try to bury it. Sometimes, the truth doesn't change everything at once, but it changes something, even if it's just the way people listen." Ayanna met his gaze, and for the first time, something close to understanding flickered in her eyes. She had seen what had happened. She had seen the fractures, the silence, the slow unspooling of the truth. But she had also seen how her silence, how the weight of what she had endured, had shifted the balance of power. She wasn't alone in this fight anymore. The meeting, when it came, wasn't about grand speeches or dramatic gestures. It wasn't a spectacle. It was a quiet, uncomfortable reckoning. Ayanna spoke first, her words measured, direct, not seeking sympathy but simply laying out the facts. She spoke of the harassment, the mockery, the weight of being the target. But she also spoke about something more. How silence had always been her weapon. How silence, once weaponized, could undo what was intended to crush her. Principal Hughes followed her, adding context, tracing the patterns. He didn't raise his voice. He simply spoke calmly, detailing the school's failure to act, how the system had ignored the signs for years, how the culture of silence had protected the aggressors, not the victims. By the end of the hearing, Ayanna's words had already started to echo beyond the room. The room that was meant to contain the damage had only spread it further. Hughes didn't try to control the narrative. He let the truth move through the room like a rising tide, and it began to shift everything. The district's findings were released quietly, but the consequences were anything but. Brandon's name began to trend locally. Someone leaked the security footage from the lunchroom, and it spread like wildfire, shared, reposted, and dissected. What people didn't expect was the reaction that followed, not just from Ayanna, but from within the boys' own circles. A sophomore girl posted a long thread detailing how Kyle had harassed her during sophomore orientation, how she reported it, and how it was dismissed. She posted screenshots of the email exchanges, the quiet dismissals that had allowed the behavior to continue. A former student now in college commented on the video with a single line, "That's the same boy who followed me to my car 3 times and was never written up." The thread grew longer, the tone changed, and something irreversible began to unfold. But the final shift came on Thursday, when, in a quiet district hearing, not meant to be public, Ayanna and Hughes were invited to speak, not just about the incident, but about the larger culture that had allowed it to happen. The room was packed, the tension thick in the air, but Ayanna felt something shift inside her. She wasn't walking into the room as a victim. She wasn't just a teenager fighting for her dignity. She was speaking for the others who hadn't been heard, for the ones who had been silenced. Hughes didn't sit beside her as an administrator, but as a quiet ally. Both of them knew that this moment, small as it seemed, was a turning point. The room grew quiet as Ayanna spoke, her words clear, unyielding, and precise. And for the first time, the truth had a voice that couldn't be ignored. The questions came fast from the board members. How did we miss this? What's next? How do we fix this? Ayanna didn't answer their questions with hopes or empty promises. She didn't try to sugarcoat anything. She simply looked at them and said, "The truth isn't complicated. It's uncomfortable, but it's the only way forward. If you want to change something, you have to start by listening. You have to stop pretending that silence is okay." The meeting ended, not with applause or victory, but with a quiet, uncomfortable acknowledgement. There were no easy answers. But as Ayanna walked out of the room, there was something in her step that was different. She wasn't just a student anymore. She was a force, and her silence had done its work. Now, it was everyone else's turn to explain themselves. His car, eyes scanning the ground, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket. He didn't see her approach, didn't hear her footsteps until she was right there. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air was thick with something unspoken, something that neither of them had fully processed. Ayanna stood still, arms crossed, watching him, letting the silence stretch out between them like a weight neither could escape. Finally, Austin looked up, his eyes hesitant, as if he hadn't expected to see her here. Or maybe he just didn't know how to face her now that everything had changed. "You're not going to yell at me?" he asked, his voice quieter than it had ever been before. There was no arrogance left in it, no smirk to mask the vulnerability. Ayanna shook her head slowly, her gaze steady. "I'm not here to yell at you. You're not worth it." He stiffened at her words, but there was no anger in his eyes, just a kind of resigned understanding, as if he knew what she meant. She wasn't asking for an apology. She wasn't seeking his remorse. She wasn't even looking for an explanation. "Then why?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. She took a step closer, her stance unwavering. "Because you need to know that you're not untouchable. And I need you to see that this isn't just about me. You can't walk through life thinking nothing will catch up to you, thinking nothing matters." He didn't respond, but Ayanna saw the shift in him, small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. He lowered his eyes, looking at the ground between them, and she knew in that moment that he understood. For the first time, Austin wasn't the one with control. It wasn't his story anymore. It was hers. "You don't have to like it," she said, her voice softer now. "But this isn't over because you think you can walk away from it." Austin didn't answer her. He just nodded slowly, as if the weight of her words was finally sinking in. He took a deep breath, his shoulders slumping slightly as he pushed off from the car, still not meeting her eyes. "I'm not going to forget," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Ayanna didn't say anything more. She simply turned and walked away, the sound of her steps steady, sure, echoing in the quiet lot behind the school. The rain had started falling harder now, the drops racing down the glass like tiny rivers, and the world felt different. Not just because things were changing, but because Ayanna was changing too. She wasn't just a bystander anymore, a student watching from the sidelines. She was the one in control, the one writing the story, and for the first time, she felt the power of her own voice. As she crossed the parking lot, her back straight, her head held high, she didn't look back at Austin or the school behind her. She had said what needed to be said. The rest would come on its own, and when it did, it would be undeniable. The truth wasn't quiet anymore. It had a voice, and that voice was hers. Looking back, she walked off the stage. The room was still, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze in the silence she left behind. The weight of her words hung in the air, reverberating through the auditorium like a soft echo. No one spoke for a few seconds, but the tension had shifted. The walls of the room, once so full of pretense, now felt like they were closing in on the truth Ayanna had spoken. Principal Hughes watched her, his eyes steady, his expression calm, but there was something new in it now, something that mirrored the quiet power Ayanna had carried throughout the ordeal. She had said what needed to be said, and for the first time, it didn't matter how the media framed it, how the district tried to spin it. It was already too late for that. As she stepped down, Ayanna caught Lena Mercer's gaze. The journalist's face was unreadable, but there was a quiet respect in her eyes, a kind of acknowledgement that the story wasn't over. It was just beginning. When Ayanna left the stage, the room still buzzed with a quiet energy. She had said what needed to be said. No grand gestures, no theatrical speeches, just the truth, delivered plainly, firmly. The message was clear. I won't be silent anymore. And in the days that followed, the truth started to spread in ways no one expected. Parents began calling the school not to complain, but to ask questions. People started noticing the patterns, and they couldn't ignore the growing wave of accountability. Teachers who had once turned a blind eye started speaking out. Students, too, who had been silent, started sharing their stories. The walls of silence had cracked, and no one knew how to put them back together. Ayanna's actions had set something in motion that couldn't be undone. By the end of the week, the school board issued a public statement announcing a third-party review of campus disciplinary practices. The district began the process of revisiting their policies, and Ayanna's voice had become the catalyst for that change, not because of what she had said alone, but because it had been undeniable. The truth, after all, always finds a way to rise to the surface. Through it all, Ayanna didn't change. She still arrived at school every day on time, still completed her assignments, still moved through the hallways with that same calm presence. But now, her silence wasn't a weakness. It was strength. It was the quiet certainty that, when the moment came, she would not hesitate to speak. In the end, the building hadn't changed. The walls still stood. The bells still rang. But the illusion that had protected the boys, that had shielded the system, was gone. And Ayanna, though she never sought fame or recognition, had become the one thing they could no longer ignore. The truth wasn't just visible now, it was undeniable. "Now what?" Darius repeated, his voice steady, but with a trace of curiosity, as though waiting for her to decide how to answer. Ayanna stood still for a moment, looking out at the gym. The echoes of punches, the rhythm of the bag being hit, the steady thud of gloves against pads, they all seemed so distant, like a memory, even though she was standing in the middle of it. "I keep moving forward," she said simply, her voice even but firm. She didn't need to say more. Darius didn't need more. They both understood. The fight wasn't over. It wasn't a single victory, a single moment of change. It was ongoing. The work of making space for herself, of holding the ground she had taken, would be continuous. But now, she was prepared. Her hands, her mind, and her spirit were stronger for it. Darius gave a slight nod, a silent acknowledgement. "That's right," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "That's the way you keep fighting." Ayanna exhaled slowly, wiping the sweat from her brow. Her muscles were sore, but she didn't mind. She hadn't come back to the gym for relief. She came back to remind herself, once again, that her strength wasn't something anyone could take from her. Not then. Not now. She turned back to the center of the ring, eyes focused, ready for the next round. Not of boxing, but of everything else. She was ready. As the session ended, Darius tossed the gloves back to her. "You've got this, Ayanna." She nodded, the weight of his words grounding her like a rock in the current. She didn't stop to look back as she left the gym. She had never been the kind to look back. Forward was where the fight, the journey, and the victories waited. And now, for the first time in a long time, Ayanna Blake knew that the next steps would be hers to take. The final days of the semester passed in a quiet drift, the kind that comes after everything is shifted. The building still looked the same, but Ayanna no longer felt like she had to survive it. She moved through the halls without tension in her shoulders, no longer scanning for the next confrontation or wondering who might test her patience or her silence. The world hadn't become safe. It was just that she no longer felt small inside it. She stopped carrying her notebook, not because the work was done, but because others had begun to take up the cause themselves. A group of students had formed an accountability committee, informal, unofficial, but present. They kept notes, asked questions, listened, and when they passed her in the halls, they didn't ask for her approval. They just nodded, like they already knew what she'd taught, without ever having to say it aloud. She saw Principal Hughes less often now. His work had doubled, maybe tripled, after the district's response, but the brief moments they shared were always marked by the same understanding that what they had built together didn't need repeating. It lived in the systems now, in the training sessions quietly added to the calendar, in the shifts in tone during staff meetings, and in the fact that students who looked like her no longer had to earn their humanity one interaction at a time. One afternoon, near the end of the year, she passed his office just as he stepped out to retrieve a stack of reports from the copier. "You think they'll keep it going?" she asked, her voice calm but curious. He looked up, a glimmer of fatigue behind his eyes, but something steady behind that. "Some will," he said, "and the rest will adjust." She nodded, more a gesture of understanding than agreement. "That enough for you?" "It's enough to begin," she replied. Outside, spring had finally broken through the long chill. The trees lining the school's perimeter bloomed in bursts of white and pale green, and students lingered on the front steps after the bell, caught in that strange space between endings and beginnings. Ayanna walked past them without needing to measure her pace or calculate her expression. She didn't need to hold herself together anymore. She was whole. Word had spread that Austin's family had moved quietly. No ceremony, no farewell. The house was sold to a couple with 2 young children, and by the end of the month, someone else's car sat in his usual spot. Ayanna didn't feel vindicated. She felt finished. What mattered now wasn't where they had gone, but what she had stayed to build. At home, the atmosphere had softened. Her parents hadn't become suddenly attentive or overflowing with emotion, but there were small shifts. Dinners eaten together, questions asked without agenda. Her father occasionally watched the news clips of her interview without saying much, just nodding slightly when her name was mentioned. It wasn't repair, but it was recognition. On the final week of school, she returned to the same spot in the cafeteria where it had all begun. This time, she didn't sit in the shadows. She sat near the center, surrounded not by a crowd, but by calm. A new student, a girl with a shy voice and dark eyes, passed her on the way to an empty seat. Ayana caught her gaze and then gestured. "You can sit here," she said. The girl paused, surprised. Then she sat. They didn't talk much, just shared space, the kind that had once been denied to Ayana, but now belonged to both of them. Later that afternoon, as students filed out for summer break, she passed the glass doors and paused beneath the school's motto, "Excellence through community." For the first time, it didn't feel ironic, not because the school had lived up to it, but because she had. She walked home slowly that day, not in a hurry, letting the sun settle into her shoulders. She passed the corner store, the bus stop, the apartment building with the peeling paint, and the kids laughing on the steps. These streets were hers in a way the school had never fully been, but now they were connected. Now they belonged to the same story. That night, she stood in her room, pulling the last of her books from her bag. She found the old braid tucked between the pages of a journal she hadn't opened in weeks. She held it for a long moment, not with pain, but with reverence. Then she placed it gently in a box, closed the lid, and set it on the highest shelf in her closet, not to forget, but to remember who she had become after they tried to take something from her. She didn't need a monument. She was one.